the one that concerns all monotheistic religions, including Christianity. Prepare to be shocked, so be intellectually open-minded, because we agree that Islam, like Judaism, so Judaism, if you take it, has had a periodicity, if you like, a trajectory that has lasted around 1,300 years. If you take Moses in the 12th century BC and the defeats in the great Judeo-Roman wars in the 1st century AD, that's 1,300 years. It's not, once again, the end of the Islamic cycle, but it's on the order of that. If you take the middle of the 17th century, the end of Muhammad's preaching, and take today, we're a little less than 1,300 and 1,400 years away. So we're on the same order of magnitude. So you're going to say, and you'd be right, the beginning of Christianity doesn't fit in with what I said about Islam and Judaism, because we don't at all have a prophet who appears in a situation of collapse and who imposes himself by arms and wins successes like that. That's not the image of Christ at all. So before I get into the monotheistic cycle, there's just one more point I'd like to make. The advent of Christ, we find equivalents in the history of Islam. Since Jesus appeared in the history of Judaism, we find the equivalent in the history of Islam. The history of Islam. We find the equivalent at precisely the same period, in the final phases. That's when the Mahdist movement, the Messianist movement appeared. On the one hand, you have the violent Messianists, the ones I've already mentioned, but you also have, in a much smaller minority, but that's when it also appears, you have Messianists like Jesus, who call for world peace, brotherhood, and so on. And above all, they carry a fundamental message, the end of the political nature of religion. Jesus' message in Christianity, my kingdom is not of this world. He puts an end to the idea of religion as the organizer of the political and social world, Let me remind you, as I said, that these religions, these political monotheism, like Islam and Judaism, are born in a phase of complete decay of the state, of society, of anarchy. And so it's at the heart of their message that religion serves to reorder the community. And that's why the precepts are so strong and strict. It's a very dirigist religion, very social, very much based on social pressure, and so on. It enables society remaking. And Christ, in Judaism, breaks all that. He comes along and takes religion and spirituality out of it. It's no longer about politics, it's about individual salvation. It's no longer a social issue, and it's not a question of power here on earth beyond. So it's that kind of detachment. Well, we find the same kind of thing in Islam from the 19th century on. It's precisely in this 19th century that the Mahdists begin to appear. As you know, Wahhabism, which is at the origin of the Saudi Arabian monarchy, which is somewhat of the same essence, appeared at the end of the 18th century. And the first great Mahdist revolt I told you about in Sudan at the end of the 19th century was also at that time. And so you have two figures in particular in the Muslim world who correspond quite well to this, who are trying to make a kind of Muslim version of Christianity. In fact, simply leaving to Islam what Christianity is to Judaism, to ancient Judaism in particular. So the main and most significant thing is the figure of the Bab. So I don't know how it's pronounced. It's created with an A accent but inverted. I don't know if it's pronounced Bab, but you'd have to ask someone who speaks a bit of Persian in the comments not to hesitate to intervene. It was a character whose real name was Sayyid Ali Muhammad Siradi, whose life story is strikingly similar to that of Jesus Christ. I'm going to read you an extract from what I had summarized in my History of the Century to Come. Born in 2809, showing impressive abilities in the religious school where he studied as a child, he announced in 1844, yes, that's going back a bit, to a mystical Muslim who was traveling the country in search of the Mahdi, to whom he offered hospitality, that he was indeed the Mahdi. The mystic, named Mullah Hussein, became his first disciple, soon followed by 18 others in all. The Bab, i.e. the Gate, set off with his latest disciple, Qudus, on a pilgrimage to the holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina, just as Christ went to Jerusalem. His preaching attracts ever-growing crowds, and the governor of Shiraz orders his arrest to please the Muslim clergy. Here you have the arrest requested by the usual clergy, like the priests who had Jesus arrested by the Roman authorities. And it has to be said that his doctrine goes a long way towards abolishing Sharia law. In the same spirit, once again, we go beyond the pure social and political organization of society. The Bab decides to surrender to the authority. So he doesn't resist, he surrenders, like Christ, and is placed under house arrest until 2846. It's less violent than in ancient times. Once freed, he resumed his journey, once again irritating the clergy, who referred him directly to the cat. The cat from Iran, not the cat, that's mine, yeah, cat, S-H-A-A. The Bab is arrested, several times transferred from one fortress to another because of his popularity. Taken to Tabriz, he is tried, and during his trial, when asked who he is, he announces that he is the chosen one awaited by Muslims, whereupon he is mocked and molested before being imprisoned. It's an account that's extremely close to what we read in the Gospel. In 1850, it was decided that he would be executed in 2 stages. Other sources mention death on the first attempt, but it's a little vague. First, he was hung on the wall of the Tabriz fortress on July 9th, along with a young disciple who had asked to die with him. The platoon supposed to shoot them fired under the gaze of the crowd, but they escaped unharmed, the ropes suspending them being severed by a bullet, which terrified the Armenian Christians in the regiment, those who believe in miracles. Shortly afterwards, another attempt resulted in the Bab's death from gunshot wound. His body was recovered by the so-called Babis, his disciples, and buried on Mount Carmel in Haifa in 1919, much later. The story is very similar to the life of Jesus Christ. The big difference is that there is no resurrection. In other words, even attempts to make people believe in a resurrection have never been successful. He just died, and his disciples took him away and buried him. And all the while, he continued to make his prophetic claim, sharing his teaching, his texts, etc. with others. So what's interesting is that this gave rise to a second prophet follower, so to speak. The Babists were practically exterminated by the Persians. So either they were exterminated or they converted to Baha'i, which is what I'm going to tell you about right. So this is Baha'u'llah, in fact. I don't know how it's pronounced, but I could pronounce it like that, the way it's spelled, with an H in the middle. So Baha'u'llah was part of the Bab's succession. So he was born in 2777. And in 2763, i.e. some 15 years after the Bab's death, he said that he was the one who was to be manifested by God after that prophet. And so he becomes a kind of new prophet. Well, his life is a bit similar. He too is arrested, persecuted by the Persian authorities, etc. So it's very amusing. Well, it's very amusing because the Baha'u'llah in fact looks rather like what he is in relation to the Bab, what he is in relation to Christ, the figure of Paul, the apostle, that is, the one who really gets the message out, makes lots of disciples and so on. The only difference is that Paul never called himself a prophet, a new prophet. Whereas Baha'u'llah, it must also be said that Paul came after Jesus Christ, who was supposed to be God and dead and resurrected, whereas he came after someone who was just dead, so it must have been more logical to be like that. So that's one who appeared in the Persian world, and we have another who appeared in Pakistan, well, in Punjab to be exact. At the time it was the British Empire of India, called Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who founded the movement we now call Ahmadism, Ahmadiyya. So he was born in 2835, so it's later, but there are more Ahmadists today, some 10 or 20 million, whereas there are less than 10 million Baha'is, I believe, in the world. It's not a great success, but it's a bit like the Christians in the beginning compared to the Jewish population. So Mirza Ghulam Ahmad claimed in 2849 to have received a revelation and to have been invested by Allah with a mission to renovate and purify Islam. And then he proclaimed himself, and it was very syncretic, he proclaimed himself both Mahdi, an avatar of the Hindu god Krishna, and Jesus of Nazareth back on earth. So you see a synthesis, it's solid. And then he asked Muslims to stop jihad and advocate pacifism, so it's the same idea all over again. What's really interesting is that he said he was to Muhammad what Jesus was to Moses. So you see, he had somehow analyzed the whole thing. So here's the emergence in itself of a Christian figure, at the very least. It's part of the long cycle of these monotheistic religions in their final phase. You've got the hard aspect that gets beaten up and exterminated, and you've got the soft aspect that can give rise to other, more open spiritualities. And then there's the third branch, Rabbinic Judaism, i.e. Those who hold on to tradition, who abandon violence, but who refuse to accept the novelties of Christ's figures, and who will therefore create a third version that will no longer be missionary, but will be a little more conservative, retreating into what they've got, which is what Judaism is today. Today, So I come back to my question of political monotheisms. So we agree, Muhammad, Moses, we saw the parallel earlier. We saw the parallels in Islam with the figure of Jesus Christ, but we don't see the parallel between Jesus Christ and Muhammad. That seems completely contradictory to me given everything I've just explained. So, what characterizes the political monotheisms? If you take the cycle I told you, you have to look for a figure who would correspond to Muhammad or Moses in Christianity. Because I told you earlier, and I'm sorry, that's where I'm going with this, I told you that Christianity had given rise to things that are totally comparable to what we've seen in Islam, violent conversions and so on. So where does this come from? When the initial prophetic figure is not at all the same. Well, in fact, you had in Christianity a local and temporary phase of political monotheism, which doesn't sum up this religion, but which was grafted onto it, in fact. And it was grafted onto it simply because something similar to Muhammad and Moses. And that something was the Emperor Constantine. Let me explain a little, because I'm sure it's not easy to swallow at once, but you'll understand it's quite simple. In the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire faced a severe crisis called military anarchy, lasting over 50 years. This military anarchy was brought to an end by Diocletian, the Emperor Diocletian, who established a system known as tetrarchy. When we study Roman history, there's always the part about the tetrarchy. You get the impression that it was something that lasted a long time, when in fact it only lasted as long as Diocletian. It lasted about 20 years, so it's not really a system because it's a system that never really worked. The only thing was that Diocletian had the power to arrange things around him as he wished, but the tetrarchy system as he had conceived it didn't work autonomously. As soon as Diocletian left, at the beginning of the 4th century AD, there was a power struggle between the various great authorities of the empire, i.e. the great generals, to regain power. In other words, it's a total continuation of military anarchy. It's a kind of military anarchy that resumes episodically after Diocletian, but it's not really over. With Diocletian there was a significant parenthesis, unlike any in the past 5 years. And so it's a time when traditional religions have taken a beating, to put it crudely. People don't really believe in gods anymore. You've got intellectual currents like ephemerism that believe that gods, it's a kind of ancient atheism, because it believes that the gods are in fact heroic figures, historical characters who have been glorified. The Greek thinkers went quite far in their theory on this. You have opposing traditions. You have Mithraism, you have Neoplatonism, you have Christianity, you have Judaism, but its dynamic has been broken, so it no longer counts. So you no longer have a structuring religion for the population as a whole. You no longer have any. You have traditional institutions that have collapsed. You've got an empire that isn't even really Roman anymore because the capital is now in Ravenna and Milan. The world is truly collapsing. In fact, the Roman Empire could have collapsed completely for the time being if it hadn't been for Diocletian, who restored things a little, and then Constantine, as we shall see. It probably would have collapsed as early as the 3rd century. But what happens is that you have this collapse, you have this mystical fever that appears, and you've got military leaders who start fighting, who start championing of religion. So there's the phenomenon of trying to recreate a social cement. And so you have the partisans of the old gods, those who were Constantine's enemies, Maxents. As for Constantine, he was immersed in a Christian environment. He wasn't a Christian himself. You know, he was a convert at the end of his life, but he was immersed in that environment. And he really went down that road, the road of Christianity, because after the Battle of the Milvus Bridge, which opened the road to Rome for him against his adversary in 23, he won this battle. You know the anecdote, I think. He is said to have had a dream in which he saw a bright sign in the sky. So it wasn't the cross. Sometimes we present it to ourselves as the cross. It wasn't the cross, it was chrism. In other words, this sign with the 2 letters K and O of the Greek alphabet, which make KRE, that is to say, which are the anagram of Christ, and so it was the symbol of Christ that was used at the time more than the cross. If he had it painted on his soldiers' shields, one. It seems to me that historically this is the only case in history. Military victory in Christian history that was won after the leader's military vision. Maybe Joan of Arc, but before that there's nothing. It's Constantine. So Constantine, who has a vision and who has a military victory based on that vision, is a prophetic figure. right? Because he has a vision, he has a communication with God that others don't have, and this vision enables him to win a military victory. And here we have the same pattern as for the Battle of Badr and for the battle against the Amalekites, for Moses and for Muhammad. In other words, we have this battle which gives victory, and which will then give Constantine other victories, and which will enable him to establish Christianity as a religion. So it wasn't he who established it as the state religion, but he did establish it as the religion in spite of everything, of power, of whoever came to power, the religion that won, right? The religion that has been selected, that benefits from a historic election. This will never be the case for Christianity in Oriembre. Among the Persians, Christianity more or less always remained, and then under a land of Islam always remained as it had been in the early days in the Roman Empire. That is to say, a minority religion, not at all violent, not at all, which does not engage in power struggles, which does not seek to convert by force. In these regions, Christianity has always remained a little like the original Christianity. But here, from Constantine onwards, Christianity also became a political monotheism. And from then on, Christianity followed the whole trajectory of political monotheism, which was also found in what I call the sea civilizations. In other words, first we have a question from Kodra. What made Jesus and Christianity so successful compared to the other prophets and their religion of that period? Well, what made it successful? Well, it all depends on what you call success, because basically before Constantine he was no more successful than the others. In any case, those who were successful, let's say the great successful religions, let's say, like Mithraism, like Aurelian's unconquerable son, etc. But the characteristic success that makes Christianity what it is today, i.e. the religion of Europe, and then of a large part of the world through the power of Europe, is because Constantine won. It was that moment of chance, and at the same time it became a political monotheism, what the others never became, Mithraism, etc., and they were exterminated. As I was saying, the competing doctrines of, for example, Muhammad, or probably Moses, who were probably involved in much the same thing. In fact, there have been just as many scholarly discussions on what Christianity borrowed from, or had in common with, Mithraism, i.e. mystery cults, where there were also stories of resurrection, etc. So we're still in the same boat, so we're still in the same old bathtub, and you've got a winner. Well, it could have been a machine gunner who won. There were many soldiers, by the way, in the Roman army who were converted to Mithraism. So that could have been the winner, but it wasn't, because chance made it so. Well, there are others who think it was God's will, but I don't know. I said I wouldn't talk about that, but in fact it's an opinion. But I'm not convinced that it was the best thing that could have happened to Christianity to become a political monotheism, precisely because it led to Christianity being associated with a whole host of things that political monotheisms do, and which correspond to a driving force, I was saying, psychosocial, which is not in line with doctrine. That's what I said at the beginning, the good grain of the booklet, etc. So that's a difficulty, really. I'd like to say it's a coincidence. You have a whole bunch of things that are thrown out at the same time that are more or less the same, and you have one that wins by natural selection, because there's an element of chance and an element, no doubt, of the fact that it's a little better done than the rest. It's simpler, it responds to instincts, it fits in well with the times, for the same reason that what makes an artist successful, there's always a little bit of live magic. Coming back to what I was saying, from Constantine's victory onwards, you have the entry into a cycle of political monotheism. First you have the prophet, so the age of the prophet, in this case, is that of Constantine, who conquers the empire. Then you have the Golden Age, what I call the Golden Age, i.e. imperial unity in religion, and this is the Christian Empire. It's when Constantius, Theodosius, etc. become empires that make Christianity the state religion, and began to base legislation, especially moral legislation, on Christian principles. So, for example, homosexuals began to be burned, which they hadn't done before, and so on and so forth. Extremely violent things, which are quite characteristic of these political monotheisms. Then there's the breakup and separation of temporal and spiritual leadership. So, first of all, the breakup is the collapse of the empire, the breakup of a barbarian kingdom, in the same way as you've had different kingdoms, Fatimid, etc., Umayyad, Abbasid. For Islam, you have the same thing before, with the kingdoms of the Middle Ages. You have the separation of the temporal from the spiritual. So it's wrongly said that there's absolutely no such thing in Islam, but that's not true. It's untrue because the temporal-spiritual distinction, which isn't really a distinction at all, is most often based on power struggles, often of a temporal nature between the Pope and the empire, then the Pope and the monarchy. You find exactly the same thing if you go to the Muslim world, to the time of the Seljuk Sultans, for example. You have military chiefs, the equivalent of emperors, if you like, or kings, the Turkish sultans, and you've got a caliph who's left to be an Arab caliph, who's supposed to be just looking after his seraglio, essentially, maybe a little religion, writing poetry, etc., but certainly not meddling in politics, certainly not meddling in military leadership. Okay? You find the equivalent of fighting between the Pope and the empire in Islamic lands, even if the fighting was less virulent in Islamic lands, because the caliph very quickly gave in. And it was only later that you had a reunion, particularly among the Ottomans, between the caliphal power and the power of the Sultan. So you've got a fairly long phase like that of constitution, of nation-state, in fact, quite simply, of creation of national religious community, which are also forged because people who belong to the same religion wage war against each other because they're not part of the same state entity, political entity. And you have the next phase, which is the phase of religious and millenarianism. In Europe, in Christianity, this phase corresponds to the rise of Protestantism. And that's where we're going to draw an interesting parallel with Islam, because if you look at Salafism, it's really a Muslim Protestantism. Salafism is the idea that we must return to the text of the Quran, to the text of the Hadith, back to the text, getting rid of all the interpretations, all the literature that has accumulated over time, back to the text, back to the fundamentals, and back to morals and organization as they were supposed to be at the time of the first Muslims. That's what Salafism is all about. It's the same thing in spirit that the Protestants wanted to do. The Protestants are all about scriptura, going back to the texts alone, dropping all interpretation, the popes, the church, etc., and forgetting about them, and return to a primitive vision of the church, before there were clergy, before there was all that. It's exactly the same movement, the same spirit, and one that's experiencing a whole host of violent millenarian movements. So you've got the Revoltucites in 15th century Bohemia. You've got Savonarola in Florence with the bonfires of vanity, this kind of theocratic totalitarian dictatorship he installed in Florence for a few years before being hanged and burned by the population who'd had enough. And you've got the Münster Anabaptists too, who are in a... If you're interested, go and read the Wikipedia article on the subject. It's very, very interesting. It was the same kind of thing. The Münster Anabaptists, they were Daesh in Germany in the 16th century. That was it, the guys... So when today people say that all this is linked to the letter of the text of the Quran, that's not true. It's not linked to that. It's linked to a historical, in a long cycle lasting 7 years. Last phase, the lowering and secularization, once the various millenarian movements over a period of 200 years have tired everyone out and we let it go. Well, that's the secularization of the European world from the 17th century onwards, the end of the 17th century, the 18th century. The Enlightenment was dropped, forgotten. Religion was dropped and relegated to the private sphere. And society became secularized, and even the Catholic Church tended to become Protestant, as has often been said, secularized, notably with the Second Vatican Council. You have this kind of disintegration, which is not the end of religion as such. It's the end of political monotheism, the end of religion's claim to dominate the political order. Because it's no longer necessary, you have a political order that has been set up that is totally irreligious, like the Roman Empire at the time of the Zealots and Jesus Christ. You have a social and political order that has been built that doesn't need religion, and so religion loses that role. And so we look for other meanings. Do you agree? And in particular, we're moving towards much more spiritualization. And so you have a Christianity that tends to become, in European societies, what it has never ceased to be in societies where it is not a political monotheism. That is, particularly in the East. Do you agree? That's how the trajectory was made. So this idea of political monotheism, if you like, is operative, it works, it sticks, and it's important to understand where we are today in terms of what Islam is becoming. Because if you look at this great phase of secularization of Europe, it corresponded particularly in the 19th century, with the end of the old political systems that were linked to religion, which were the monarchies. And you had in particular a very interesting event which quite rightly gave the name of the Arab Spring by imitation, which was the springtime of the peoples of the years of the year of the time. Nor, at the time, did it immediately lead to the democratization of the European world. It was not until decades later, not until the end of the Second World War, not until the end of the First World War, that Europe really began to democratize, apart from England and France. But already, if you like, it was part of this phenomenon, which is therefore a much deeper phenomenon of, and here we come back to what I said at the very beginning, that is to say, this is social psychology. It's not a question of doctrine. It's not a question of what's written in the texts. No, texts are interpreted and used according to the psychosocial impulse of the moment. Is that clear? When you're in a system of monotheism,